Episode 1. The Making of BTK. 10 victims, over 30 years of fear, a respectable husband, father, and church leader by day, a methodical predator by night, the man who named himself BTK, bind, torture, kill. A man who tied knots tighter than his own conscience and watched children die while calmly taking notes. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in 1945 in Kansas, a place of quiet neighborhoods and ordinary lives where monsters were not supposed to exist. But they do, especially the kind that learn to smile before they learn to lie. As a child, he kept to himself, seemingly shy, the kind of boy teachers might describe as respectful and attentive. Inside, though, he nursed fantasies that grew like weeds through the cracks of a neat suburban sidewalk. He experimented with cruelty toward animals, a private rehearsal for control. He learned that binding was power, that silence could be engineered, and that fear had a flavor you could acquire over time. In adolescence, he began stealing women's underwear, not for mischief, but for ritual. He layered fantasy on top of theft, bondage on top of fantasy, and strangulation on top of bondage, building a private liturgy in which he played both priest and God. He learned the ordinary masks early. Politeness, routine, good manners, the kind of camouflage you can't buy but can perfect through imitation, because he understood even then that a predator who looks like a predator doesn't last very long. By the early 1960s, he joined the United States Air Force, a decision that gave him structure, routine, and a cover identity that would later become essential. The military taught precision and patience, the value of checklists and the calm that comes from doing the same mechanical task until it becomes muscle memory. Nothing in that world cured what lived inside him. If anything, the discipline taught him how to schedule his appetites, how to compartmentalize the urge and the performance, how to write the rules he would later break. When he returned to Kansas, he married Paula Dietz and moved into a life that looked exactly like the dream, with a white picket fence, 2 children, a modest home, predictable commutes, a lawn that learned to obey the mower, and a church that welcomed helpful hands. Rader served on the church council. He worked in compliance and later as a municipal code officer. He volunteered. He smiled at neighbors and waved to kids. He learned to be seen just enough to never be watched. In those years, he refined what he would later call projects, a cold word that turned people into tasks, homes into job sites, and lives into lists. He prowled neighborhoods at dusk, testing doors, mapping routines, learning the geometry of opportunity. He kept a hit kit, a bag of rope, tape, tools, and props that turned ordinary rooms into small theaters where he controlled the script. He chose victims who fit fantasies he'd grown since adolescence. He studied their schedules, learned who slept when and who answered doors even when they were afraid. He practiced false voices, invented minor pretexts to cross thresholds without force, and learned how to break a lock without breaking the silence. Before the world knew his name, before a city learned the acronym BTK, Dennis Rader had already built the operating system of a serial killer. Surveillance to select, staging to approach, binding to control, torture to escalate, and a ritualized exit to preserve trophies and memory. January the 15th, 1974. A cold morning in Wichita, Kansas, where families warmed kitchens with coffee and radios, where routine felt like armor. The Otero family lived in a small house, Joseph and July. Their children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine, JJ and Josie. A family like any other, until the door opened to the wrong man. Rader entered with a story and a weapon, the combination that unlocks compliance. He said he needed their car, money, time. He said nobody had to get hurt. He said all the things men like him say when they plan to do the opposite. He bound them one by one and turned a home into a diagram. Rope across wrists like lines in a notebook, ankles knotted, bodies arranged, a father strangled in front of his son, a mother made to watch her child watch, a daughter hanged from a basement pipe as if terror were an altar and he its officiant. Afterward, he moved through the rooms with the cold patience of a clerk closing up shop, checking for noise, wiping what he could, collecting what he wanted, and leaving what he needed the police to find. The Otero murders were not only horror, they were signature. In the weeks that followed, he relived the scene in secret, the way some men revisit vacation photos. He replayed the steps, savored the arrangement, and studied the points where the plan could be improved. What shocked the city, what broke its spine, became for him an instruction manual. Wichita read the headlines: family slain, police seek leads, and tried to understand why a quiet neighborhood could produce such a violent equation. Rader read the same stories and took notes about what the police didn't know. He learned that the absence of a suspect is a kind of praise, that silence in a newsroom can feel like applause to the man who made it happen. He filed away details for later letters, the ones that would prove he was the author of the crime and that everyone else was a poor imitator. He struck again on April 4, 1974, in a small home that was supposed to be safe because people come and go and neighbors notice. Kathryn Bright returned to her house with her brother Kevin, the kind of ordinary interruption that should cancel any predator's script. Rader adjusted because predators who survive learn to improvise. He attacked with a knife and a gun, stabbing Kathryn, shooting Kevin, who somehow survived by escaping with bullets in his head and face. Kathryn did not. A young woman who had a future became an object in a private display, and Rader left feeling the familiar mix of electricity and fatigue that follows a finished ritual. The city's fear fermented into paranoia. Doors grew new locks, windows learned the habit of staying shut, and children learned to sleep with lights on. The police worked the case as if work could substitute for a lead. It's hard to explain the thrill a man like Rader felt when he realized the city had no idea that he could stand among them and talk about the murders in a polite voice while they nodded and said it was all so terrible. He understood that the costume of normal life was more than camouflage. It was a passport. He carried that passport everywhere. At the grocery store, where he bought rope with bread and milk. At church, where he learned who would be home on Wednesday nights. At work, where he enforced minor rules with major satisfaction, practicing control in small doses while saving the larger ones for weekends. He perfected the pre-offense ritual: scouting, stalking, fantasy escalation, tool preparation, and he refined his post-offense routine. Trophy storage, notes in code, posed memories that proved to him that he was the director of something no one else could see. The press, hungry for answers and spooked by the randomness, printed what they had: timelines, appeals for witnesses, phone numbers, reassurances that the police were pursuing several promising leads. They were not. Rader watched the news crawl across television screens and thought about how an invisible hand could move an entire city. Somewhere in that pause between story and silence, he decided on something that would alter the relationship between killer and city. He would write. He would announce himself like an author, placing a byline beneath a headline everyone had already read. He would prove that the man calling was the man in the room, and he would pick a name that sounded like an instruction manual. In October 1974, the Wichita Eagle received a letter with details only the killer could know. The way ropes were tied, the position of bodies, the private geometry of the Otero house. It was not a confession, it was a signature. He called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill. 3 words that turned into a brand, a logo stamped on fear. The letter explained how he had planned, what he had done, and hinted he would do it again. A different city might have ignored the theatrics. Wichita couldn't. They printed excerpts. They warned residents. They begged for anyone to remember anything. And Rader, who had expected attention, received it, the kind that feeds a compulsion the way oxygen feeds a flame. The police formed task forces and subcommittees and bought new filing cabinets. They called meetings and mapped patterns and measured rope lengths against knot styles. They did the things professionals do when professionalism feels like progress. None of it changed the math. Rader adjusted again. He learned which avenues produced the least risk, which windows were too close to night commuters, which phone lines could be cut without rearming a neighbor's dog. He experimented with different approaches, new pretexts at doors, better lies in parking lots, a smile that looked more like a neighbor and less like a stranger. When he walked alone at night, he built fantasies that felt like blueprints. When he returned home, he folded into family life with the soft precision of a man hiding in a photograph. The 1974 murders were not isolated events. They were prototypes. By 1977, he had refined his process into something he believed was unbreakable. Surveil, select, stage, strike, savor, store. In March of that year, he forced his way into the home of Shirley Vian, a young mother with children. He corralled the children into a bathroom, tied the door shut, and strangled their mother in the next room. Later, he would write as if the children were props, as if their fear were a spice in a recipe he repeated. The police arrived to a scene that felt like a lecture on helplessness. That same year, he murdered Nancy Fox and then called the police himself to report the crime. When the dispatcher asked where, he gave the address. When she asked who was speaking, he hung up. Then he sat somewhere in the city and listened to the sirens he had summoned. BTK's letters grew more elaborate. Poems, crude drawings, instructions and demands for attention that echoed the neediness of a child banging a spoon on a high chair. He wanted a name in the paper, a column inch for each binding, a paragraph for each bruise. He wanted to be read, and he wanted to be feared, and he wanted to be studied by the men he mocked in uniform. The police understood that printing too much could amplify him. Printing too little could provoke him. They navigated the space between, releasing fragments sufficient to warn but insufficient to gratify. Rader read those fragments with a collector's pride, clipping them for a private archive that grew with each crime and each letter like rings in a tree trunk. His daytime life thickened around him like insulation. Church meetings, potlucks, committee notes, a reputation for being exacting about rules and law and ordinances. He wrote violations with the relish of a man who believes control is a virtue and power a birthright. Neighbors learned to keep their grass trimmed not because of city code, but because of him. They joked about the little Hitler writing tickets, never guessing the scale of the dictator in their neighborhood. He raised children and scolded them for small disobediences, taught them the outer shape of morality while he emptied its center. At night, he returned to his private theater, where he arranged dolls and ropes and staged rehearsals that rewrote memory to his liking. Wichita adapted in visible ways: deadbolts, motion lights, self-defense classes, newspapers folded open to crime updates at every breakfast table. Yet the essential vulnerability remained. A man who studies your habits can become a part of them. A man who blends can become background. A man who smiles can pass through thresholds most monsters never cross. Rader's confidence swelled with each successful entry and quiet exit. He learned not only to predict how victims would behave when bound, but how the city would behave when threatened. His letters began to inject game theory into the public conversation. Do this, or I might do that. Tell me this, and perhaps I'll do less of that. A predator negotiating with the people he hunted. By 1979, he escalated in a way that revealed both hunger and failure. He targeted Anna Williams, an older woman he believed fit a private profile. He broke into her home and waited for hours, rehearsing lines he would never say, watching a clock that moved with the slow grace of a predator trying to synchronize with fate. She never arrived. By chance, she didn't return when he needed her to, and he left furious. Later, he mailed her a letter that dripped with resentment, telling her how close she had come to death, how carefully he had prepared, how disappointed he was by a missed appointment with murder. For the city, it was a sign that vigilance could save you. For him, it was a wound to ego, a reminder that control is an illusion even for men who worship it. The late 1970s forged the public myth of BTK. The acronym became talisman and taboo, a set of letters you didn't want to say near windows. Parents taught children new routes home. Men who prided themselves on reason-checked closets at night. The city's identity bent around the idea that a shadow could have a name and a smile. The police worked the case with new technology that always felt a beat behind. Composite sketches multiplied, tip lines rang, and the task force swelled. Every new piece of information failed to connect to all the others. The killer had become both everywhere and nowhere. Invisible in headlines, invisible in handcuffs, an algebra problem without enough numbers. Meanwhile, Rader refined the one skill most serial predators botch. He learned to wait. He let seasons pass without public activity, let the city's shoulders drop a few centimeters, let threads grow cold enough that tying them together again would require heat he alone could supply. He took jobs that gave him access to neighborhoods and homes, jobs that taught him schedules, jobs that positioned him as a man you let in, because refusing would feel impolite. He learned the intimacy of routine inspections, the way a man can measure a family's vulnerability by the crumbs on a countertop or the stack of mail near a door. The letter that named him BTK did more than brand the crimes. It changed the story's center of gravity. The city was no longer only reacting to murders, it was reacting to a voice. He fed that voice with just enough detail to remain credible and just enough cruelty to remain unforgettable. He sprinkled bad spelling like breadcrumbs, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. He wrote poems that failed as literature but succeeded as threats. He drew crude scenes that confirmed what detectives feared, that what happened in those rooms was not only killing, it was theater. The climax of this first act lives in that mixture, the moment a man stepped out of the shadows not to confess but to brag, and the moment a city realized the killer read the paper too. And yet, for all the noise, the investigation had no spine to break. There was no arrest, no suspect solid enough to push into a confession, no fingerprint that nestled where it shouldn't. Just a city living inside a story written by the man who promised to keep writing it. He made a new promise. He would kill again. He said it with the certainty of a man who believed his appetite was destiny. He said it like a weather report from a storm he alone could summon. The patrol cars kept rolling through neighborhoods like prayers on wheels. The task force kept building walls of photographs and timelines that looked like modern art. The press kept printing what it could, and BTK kept feeding on fear as if fear were food. The monster has chosen its next victim. Tomorrow, when I read the paper, I'll know who it will be. But by then, it will be too late.